My talk is about the future, this being Future Day. So, of course, where I begin when I think about the future is the past. And the question always is, how far back? How far back in the past should one look? And I'm going to begin my presentation with data from 1900. So this is a graph showing consumer technology adoption beginning in 1900. And for each technology, you'll see the name here on your right. And the dates are on the bottom. So, for example, as I move my cursor, you'll see the stove data emerge. And this vertical scale is measuring penetration, meaning how many households in the United States use this technology. So this would, for example, suggest in 1909 that 10% of American households had a stove. So indeed, back to 1900, in that epoch cited by Goodyear, this was the killer technology. And a very good technology it is. It's so good that we still use it today. Not something that can be said for everything coming out of the 19th century. But this is, what I want to draw attention to is the speed of growth. And when you look at this emerging technology, you'll see a certain rate of growth, and that's the slope of the line. So you can see, for example, that it took until about 1950s for the stove to reach 90% penetration, and what we might call saturation, so that everybody has it. And by the way, the bottom of the graph is only 10%, so this isn't a graph from 0 to 100, but from 10 to 90, the most interesting part of a growth curve as far as technology is concerned. So this is, by way of illustration, the 19th century technology emerging into the 20th century. Now, the next one is a quintessentially 20th century technology, the telephone. And here you see it in 1920 or so, in the United States at least, reaching nearly 40%. And then, of course, there was a dip. And this dip was occurring starting in the year 1929, which in the United States was the beginning of the Great Depression. So certainly technologies don't go constantly up. They have these dips occasionally, but then it recovered. Even so, by 1940s, it was back to that level it was before the Depression, and then continued rising, and in fact reached all the way to saturation. But it did so, as you can see here, only till the 1970s. Quite a long run. So let's see what's next. After the telephone, electricity actually came. It reached this very rapid growth also after the telephone, in fact, but once it did, it grew faster. And you see here the growth rate, and the Depression didn't have much of an effect on it. It just wobbled a little bit, and yet it just kept going. And so by 1940s, late 40s, electricity was in every household in the United States. And next came the automobile. The automobile began about 1914. Well, of course, it began in 1886 here in Germany, but in the United States, 10% penetration happened around this moment. And what caused the growth, immediate growth, near vertical growth, was, of course, the new production system that Henry Ford introduced, and this is almost all Model T. And you see how quickly it reached 50%. This is an amazing story. Even for today, we have very few things growing this rapidly, as we'll see soon. But in that time, this was a phenomenon, a huge phenomenon. But again, they had a problem during the 1930s and continuing into the 1940s, partly because of constraints on production, again, due to other needs at the time. And so we have this growth only taking place after the war, continuing until saturation, which actually didn't happen until the 1990s in the United States. Notice, however, that the post-war growth, even though phenomenal and celebrated, wasn't as fast as the growth prior to the Depression. So that's only 1914. Let's move quickly. Here's a radio. Look how fast that grew. This is exciting times for new technology, especially electronic technology or electrical technology. What we had in the 1930s was this massive new medium emerging. This is actually very important when we study media today, because this was the first ecosystem technology, the first technology that actually had to have content created for it, in the form of programming, in the form of also radio stations. New business models emerged, advertising, and so on. And you can see how quickly that grew, and this was the golden era of radio as we know it today. And the next big jump was television, and now we're into the 1940s. Television, or I should say late 40s, early 50s, television was another one of these vertical lines, very rapid growth. Again, we should see the pattern here. Radio and television grew much more quickly than labor-saving devices did. An interesting point to make. Now we're into the 1980s. Actually, 1980 was the beginning of the microwave. Remember the stove? Microwave was stove 2.0. And it grew much more quickly. Why? Because it was smaller. It was much cheaper and much more compact, and it fit within a home. You didn't have to use plumbing and things to make it happen. So the microwave is a great counterweight to the way the stove rose. And now the VCR. This is something more as we think of as consumer electronics now. And the VCR grew also very rapidly, but then had a distinct decline into this decade because of the obvious replacement with the DVD. But only after that do we see the rise of the PC, the personal computer. The information age began. And when did it begin? It began in the United States effectively in 1984, coincident with the launch of the Macintosh. So the Macintosh actually, I wouldn't say caused this, but it was at that crucial moment when the mainstream was joined by the PC. So they timed it almost perfectly in their entry into the mainstream computing market. And the PC rose fairly quickly, but not as fast as you might think. It didn't rise as fast as television or radio. And even so, it hasn't reached 100%. In fact, it began to dip into this time period we're looking at today. Actually, penetration is stagnant. And after the PC, we have, although this is actually predates the PC, the video games came into the market in the 1970s. The data shows that it's still below 50%. So video games are a bit of an odd technology. And here's the cell phone. Again, in the United States, this is actually, US was a later adopter than the rest of the world, especially Europe. The cell phone, actually, though, once it got started, it rose very rapidly. And then we have the internet. The internet began as a service, again, about 1990, in the United States, 1994, 95. This is the beginning of Internet Explorer. And this is the service of internet, not necessarily showing only the usage of the internet, but the service of purchasing an ISP service. This reached about 80%, and it's actually growing even faster than the PC because of mobile. And then we have HDTV. This is the third generation of television. Notice how fast that rose. And finally, the smartphone. The smartphone is as fast as they get, right? This is forecasting to 2014, this year. It's going to be nearly 80% in the United States. And following quickly behind is the tablet, which is at around 40% today. So that's, in a nutshell, a history of technologies, what we call maybe a century of progress. And here they are again, all of them shown on the same graph. Now, rather than showing the starting point, think of it more as sort of the ending point. At what time did these technologies reach the point of graduating or saturation? When do they pop off the stack? And you see the radio is actually the first, then electricity, then refrigeration, then the stove, then the TV, before the telephone did, then color TV, then the automobile, and then actually microwave, cell phone, and the others are still rising. That's a century for you. Consumer technology, United States only. Lots of caveats to go along with that data. But we can look at it a different way. Here it is again, shown on a very dense grid. Every line you see represents a year, right? So these are the years, 114 years, and again, the same scale on the vertical axis, sort of normalizing what normally is an S-curve, but now it looks like a line. This is how it looks. But I'm going to overlay on top of that data something else. These green bands, this represents the life expectancy of people born in the years represented. So for example, a person born in 1900, their life expectancy goes until the end of the green band. And if you follow the line down, that's about 1947. So their life expectancy at birth was 47 years. On average, that's male and female together. And so what you can see in the first half of the century is this pattern, at least in the United States, of life expectancy. And it's a ragged pattern. There's a lot of variance. One thing to note, for example, is this big dip. That represents 1918. And that dip was not because of the war, it was because of influenza, which gives you a clue that the real reason that this is so ragged is actually because of infectious diseases. And the reason it smoothed out in the later half of the century was because we had antibiotics, as well as better and vaccination, for example. So actually, most of the people who were born in the second half of the century are still alive, and so we don't see the end of their lives easily if we end the scale at 2014, as I do here. So this is today. Before I go on, let me actually illustrate one life in particular, and that's shown with that line over there. And this line is actually a person born in 1968. It's of interest to me because that is my line. That's when I was born, and I decided to color code it in certain ways. The blue part, the beginning, is my childhood. The green part are my teenage years, or maybe extended childhood, depending how you think of it. Yellow part are my college, university years, and then orange part is my working life. And again, it's still going in 2014. So I have not ended my life. And so in order to think about the future, I need to extend this graph forward. So how far forward? Well, that's a good question. I could extend it to the expected end of my life, which, if it was at birth, measured at birth, it would have been until here, which is 2038 or so. So that's my working life. Here's the present, and sort of the red area is my retirement. It's a bit depressing to think that it's so short, but that's what it was at the time. That's when I was born. That's what was expected. And so my dilemma, even if I think of it this way, is that I have to at least forecast this period here. And there's a challenge with that, because actually, I have no idea what the next line is going to be on this graph. And the weird thing is that nobody does. And the reason I'm confident in saying that is because nobody knew any of the lines that did come out, when they would come out, how rapidly they would grow, who would be in control of that trajectory, and who would benefit from it. And how do I know that? Because the market told me this. If you looked at the stock market valuations of any of the companies that actually profited from any of these lines, they did not have that discounted in their net present value years in advance. Very few years in advance. The information of success and failure in technology is embedded in the stock market. And if the stock market cannot make the prediction correctly, then it doesn't know, by definition, what the future is. And this I'm very confident of, because today, I can assure you that the lines will be drawn by players we don't know today, and whose valuations are invisible. And this makes it all very, very challenging. Why don't we think of these technologies as lifespans? as I just did here, and overlay on the human lifespans. So you have technology lifespans overlaid on human lifespans, right? I've made a slight adjustment where I've differentiated between male and female lifespans. This is male, and the extension in this orange color is the female. But more to the point, I've taken each technology and broken it up into its own little subsegments. Because technology gets adopted differently. There's an early phase, there's a middle phase, and there's a late phase. These are actually sociological phenomena. They're described as, here you see it illustrated here, EA, early adopter phase. Before that, there's even an earlier sort of a baby phase called the innovators. That's when innovators buy the thing. Then you have the early adopters. Then you have the early majority and the late majority. And all of this is very, very statistically provable. Late majority. And then at the end, you have the laggards. And so the technology is born, thrives, and tends to become a little bit stale. And very little money is made towards the end of its life. After saturation, it's essentially commoditized. And we'll just give you a quick illustration of what that means. But if you put it this way, you can see these lifespans. And then you can see the human lifespans that coexisted with these technology lives and births and deaths. And here we are again, the present shown on this white line. And there's my life. And you can imagine yours as well, relative to mine. So I'm going to just take my life and expand it out and ask this question just to test the model, just to see if it's accurate. I decided to ask, did I purchase or did my family purchase these technologies in the time frames accorded that the data shows? So for example, did my family buy a microwave when I was a child? Or actually, it would have been a very early adoption if it was as a child. I'm looking at the green area, which is when I was a teenager. Did that happen? Were we early adopters as a family? And you can go through and see how the early adopter, if we were an early adopter family, when we would buy these things. And more or less, I went through this as a personal exercise and said, pretty much, yes, we were an early adopter family. And you can see where, if you were a late adopter, and this almost never happens on old technologies, then you'd have to be buying everything now, right? Look at those purple lines there, the laggards. So that's one way to look at it. A lifespan of a middle-aged man intersected by these technologies that occurred over a century. So let's take away all the other lifespans and just look at mine for a minute. And I just did something tricky here. I extended my lifespan. Now, the reason I did that is because actually I was so depressed about my only having so few years of retirement that I went back online and I said, well, what is my life expectancy today, not when I was born? Because today it would factor in all my behavior to date. And so there's this online thing you can fill out, and based on how much you eat or smoke or drink or whatever, it gives you a probability of certain life. So it gave me a probability of 25% that I would live to be 96 years old. So that means that I need to start looking at the data all the way out to 2064. I just made myself a lot more work. But the good news is that I'm only halfway through my life. If that's the case, 25% chance of that. So here's 1968 man. This is a technology that's intersected it so far. And then we have a blank canvas for half of my life. No idea what's going to happen. Do I care? Why does it matter? I started to think a bit more, hang on, it's not just me. What about other people? So I took another person born in 1913 and thought about their life. Now, I happen to know this one sample. It's my grandmother. And she was born in 1913, and she actually lived 96 years. So I'm a little bit encouraged that I could also make it as she did. But this was her life. Without color coding, this is when it ended. And so what mattered to me also was, did she adopt these technologies or her family? it's not an easy comparison to make because she was born in Romania and lived all her life there, and their adoption curves were nowhere near that of the United States. But I asked myself this question. But I also paused then. I said, well, hold on, there's another sample I want to look at, which is my son, born in 2005. Now, if he were to live till 96, then my scope of analysis goes from 1913 to into the next century, after 2100. And in fact, this is a very selfish thing to do, to only care about the lifespan of one's own family, immediate family. But that is a normal time frame to be thinking of, given what we know about our health, given what we know about our longevity. 200 years should be, in fact, a normal time frame for analysis of technology. So let's try to frame this a different way. Here's that car industry I told you about. Remember that bar? 75, 76 years old. 75, there it is, right? And this is the beginning of that period. This is 1914. So as I draw this line, overlaid on top of that, there's another graph below it, which shows actually, notice it begins before 1900. It begins in 1886, which was, as I mentioned, the birth of the automobile. And what it's illustrating is the number of car companies born every year in the United States alone. And the blue line shows births, and the orange line shows deaths. So you have a lot of births and a lot of deaths, so companies didn't live a long time. But notice how they increased dramatically right around 1900. And there was a non-zero number of car companies in the United States, even in 1886, and they were not internal combustion cars, they were actually steam or battery powered, which was an alternative at the time. But notice as we reach the 19-teens, we have this huge explosion in innovation. We have this huge increase in new car firms created. In fact, over the total duration of this graph, there are over 1,000 car companies born in the United States. Nothing in comparison to dot-coms, nothing in comparison to app companies, but boy gosh, 1,000 companies making cars, that's a huge number. But also notice that at the moment it reached 10% penetration, it began to drop dramatically. In fact, there was a mass extinction of automobile companies in the United States once Henry Ford figured it out. And so in fact, by the early 1930s even, there were very few new car companies created. And in fact, it stayed that way until today, when we only have really one new car company in the United States, Tesla. And so this is the history of the automobile industry over its entire lifespan to date. And here's the production of PCs. Notice again, the scale in this case, however, is 400 million. 400 million is the peak there. And here's your smartphones, right? 3 different technologies. And here the number of smartphones. Now, I don't have the number of firms that actually were born and died. Many of them, again, predated the smartphone. They were in the phone business. I was employed by one, by Nokia, and it became extinct right around the time when things started taking off in smartphones. And Nokia was not the only one. There were actually 15 of them that entered the same situation. Before I go on, let me just illustrate. Here's the car business. Remember this? Just to give you a scale. So I put a line here at 25 million. So let's put that aside. I want to compare that to PCs. Unfortunately, I have to shrink it down because the PC number is much bigger. So just to show you I'm not cheating, that's 25 million line, and that's 25 million line, right? So they're on the same scale vertically, but also same scale horizontally, showing basically that this is how long it took. This was 75 years here, and this is the PC industry and how long it took to grow to that peak point. So you see it's clipped off at the top, so in order for me to make it fit, this is, both fit on the same page now, right? So you see already how a few decades later, this new industry reached much higher volumes in much less time. So let's put that aside and let's look at the smartphones next to that. Oops, Here's our scale problem. Again, we're dealing with, at the very top here, 400 million. And that's 400 million next to that. And as I showed in the previous graph, actually, smartphones are already at 1 billion units. So in order for us to see them side by side, I need to also scale it down. So this is the automobile business here in units. In the United States, globally it's a bit bigger, it's 60, but you won't see much of a difference. This is the PC industry. This is the smartphone industry halfway through. It's going to double. Easy. There's 7 billion people on the planet. They're all going to have smartphones, so they'll be buying 2 billion a year. So that's only 1 billion at the top. So you have to appreciate these numbers. They're relative to one another. We're dealing with orders of magnitude change. So back to my discussion about lifespans. Here's me, 1968 man. This is my life. And I consider myself PC man. Why? When I went to university, in this yellow area, I wanted to study computers. I thought they were going to be the big thing. Personal computers. I got one in 1985, and I loved it. And I studied computer science and computer engineering, expecting to have a career in that field. And indeed I did for quite some time. And I even foresaw that it would become an intimate computer, not just a personal computer, so I switched pretty early on to being in the smartphone business. And so I even had the foresight to sort of jump out of the frying pan, if you will, when I felt that this market would not reach as far as phones would. And yet, even though I jumped onto the next one, I didn't quite jump into the right company. So I learned a great lesson there. But think about the generation before mine. The world they lived in had 70-year technology adoption cycles. And so someone graduating, in fact, this is a person born in 1946. This is the quintessential baby boomer. If they went through childhood in the time they did, went to university and studied, say, mechanical engineering, became an auto executive or just even an auto worker, they would have had a prosperous life. In fact, they would have been retired just about now. And they're living on a pension paid by the work they did here. That's not going to be easy for 1968 man. And half of the working life remains, not sure what skills are needed. And this is the replacement for the PC. And so how is 1968 man going to adapt to this? Well, you could say, that's too bad. The next generation will figure it out. But I'm thinking about the next generation. I'm thinking about 2005 man, my son, because 2005 man, by the time he goes to university, will actually go through 3 or 4 new lines on this graph. And I have no idea what those lines are going to be. I cannot advise him on what he should study, if it were a technical education. And so the problem of forecasting the future isn't just about trying to work out your strategy as a business. Forget about it. You have no shot at it. These cycle times are so rapid, the amplitude is so high, that by the time it actually catches on, you won't even have a meeting to discuss it. What we have to get used to is a new era. This is going to be a new epoch of human civilization. That we're dealing with such enormous change in such a rapid cycle time and such huge amplitudes that we cannot absorb what's going on. Think back also to the problem of older people adopting this new technology and the gap that will exist between generations. There's always been a generational gap, but what is the generational gap between someone who's 80 years old and someone who's 80 years old, and yet they've already adopted 7 technologies later, 7 waves of technology later? So I don't really have an answer to what's going to happen next, but I encourage you to simply think about it in terms that you can measure, which is your own lifespan, your own family. And what does technology really do in this century to that fabric? And just as a footnote even, think about government. Think about institutions. Think about the law. Think about all of these things. Education. They cannot absorb this either. In fact, whether it's 1946 man, 1968 man, or 2005 man, they still are going to probably need a place to live, and they'll need a mortgage that will take the same amount of time as it did every single generation. Institutions of finance, government, taxation, infrastructure, all these things do not change their cycle times and cannot change their cycle times. They try all the time to improve 1 or 2% here and there, but they cannot move on this scale. And this is why the really disruptive aspect of the technologists, the people who bring these technologies, is that they run around circles around these institutions. They're able to exploit every opportunity, and by the time even the gap is found, it's too late. That's all I have. Any questions?
Ich weiß nicht, wie es Ihnen geht, aber ich bin geschockt. You cannot do that to us. This is like interrupting sex.
Oh, I never thought of it that way. No, the problem is...
You cannot tell the people that we don't know what we are going to do in the next 10 years, how we are ever going to survive. Give us at least some advice, at least to our, your son or our children, what are the qualities that will be needed in order to survive such a volatile kind of an...
Yeah, but can you handle it? Can you handle the truth? That is the question. The problem is this, that the systems that we have in place of thinking are going to change, are going to have to change. So a lot of the thought processes we have are obsolete themselves. So we have to re-evaluate a lot of these foundational questions. And I think we went through this as a civilization during the Renaissance. And the belief systems had to change dramatically. Everything about the way we operated had to change from either a view of the world that was central around church to central around man. And these questions now is going to be central around machines. And so the question of what is good, what is bad, what is evil, if I were to use Google's phrase, is going to have to change. So I'm not sure it's possible to even get into that discussion. I will say one thing though, and that is that this is probably, I alluded to this when I mentioned my son, what would I advise him to do? And I've sort of thought that what I'm going to advise him to do is study the classics. Because the classics and what we call liberal arts education is actually more important than ever. Poetry is going to become much more important than it ever has been, because that's where the truth will lie. The truth of technology will lie in ourselves, in a way. We have to reevaluate that relationship.
Wow. I have to train myself to recite Goethe and Schiller and all the subjects that I hated so much in school. Well, Horace, thank you very, very much for these really insightful figures. And can someone look that up somewhere? Is there a website where we find stuff like that?
I'll publish this in a way, as you can see, there's a lot of data, so it can't be told easily without motion. But slowly we're going to release all the data.
Okay. Alle Informationen auch zu ihm und seinen Studien finden Sie natürlich auch auf der Webseite von Censhare. Vielen herzlichen Dank, Horace Dediu.